everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar about agroecology, organic agriculture, and regenerative agriculture, and the need for transformation of our food systems. There is a broad consensus about the fact that our food systems today are not sustainable. They are responsible for about 1/3 of greenhouse gases. They are a major source of pollution of air, soil, and water. They do not address the triple burden of malnutrition. And from a social point of view, farmers in most parts of the world are on the lower end of society and don't have a decent income. The need for change, I think, is well recognized, but how that change should happen is still not a matter of consensus. However, there is an emerging consensus building up about the need for transformational change. The fact that just trying to improve our current system gradually is not going to be sufficient to address the concerns we have about our food systems. So in this session, we will have three speakers coming from agroecology, regenerative agriculture, organic agriculture, and a voice from Africa. The speakers are Michel Pimbert from the Center for Agroecology, Water and Resilience at the Coventry University. We will have Louise Luticold from IFOAM Organics International. We will have Chris Nichols from Canadian Organic Growers. And they will be they are coming from different perspectives from agroecology, organic and regenerative agriculture. And then we will hear from Mamadou Goita, who is from the Institute of Research and Promotion of Alternative Development in Mali, who will give us a perspective from Africa. So the way we will handle this webinar is through questions and answers. So there won't be any long presentations made. I hope that this will find this will give rise to a very dynamic interaction. So thank you to all of you for being with us today. And I will start with Michel Pimbert. How would you define agroecology? There seem to be different interpretations of what we mean by that. So what is your view? Michel? Can we have Michel, please?
Hello.
Well, there we are. Technical.
Okay.
So, did you hear my question, Michel?
Yes, I did. Thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. So how do I define agroecology? And what are some of the different understandings of what agroecology is? I think that was your question.
Yeah.
So really at the heart of agroecology is the idea that agricultural systems, agroecosystems, should mimic the structure and function of natural ecosystems. So we're talking here about biodiversity-rich fruit orchards, agroforestry systems, intercropping, polycropping, genetic mixtures, mixed farming, agro-silvopastoral production systems. And these kinds of agricultural mimics, like their natural models, can be productive, pest-resistant, and nutrient-conserving. That's the first point I want to say about agroecology. Now, it's interesting to note that scientists have developed the science of agroecology over the last 90 years. But the practice of agroecology is much, much older, with deep roots in many indigenous and peasant societies of Africa, the Americas, Asia, Australia, Europe, and Polynesia. And although those societies never adopted the term agroecology, their time-tested practices in growing food and fiber illustrate many principles of modern agroecology. And in fact, agroecology today builds on the knowledge of peasant farmers and indigenous peoples, adding new insights from ecology and the science of complexity. And I think it's important to note that unlike most conventional agricultural research and development, agroecological approaches consciously seek to combine the knowledge of farmers and indigenous people with the latest insights of the science of ecology and complexity. And in fact, good agroecologists value and build on people's knowledge and farmer-led experimentation to develop appropriate agroecological solutions along the rural-urban spectrum. The third point I want to stress is that today, agroecology considers the ecology of the whole agri-food system and no longer just focuses on the farm plot or on the ecology as the basis for the design of sustainable agriculture. Agroecology focuses on the equitable and sustainable production, processing, distribution, and consumption of food and fiber, and we can think of agroecology as the ecology of agri-food systems. Now, different meanings, yes. Agroecology has become a bit of a contested idea. Simply put, and I'm putting this very simply, there are two visions of agroecology that compete for funding and policy support today. The first is an agroecology that largely conforms with the dominant agri-food system, and the second is an agroecology that aims to fundamentally transform the dominant system and the power relations that sustain it. Now, agroecological practices that conform include, for example, sustainable intensification and climate-smart agriculture that are presented as solutions to the current crisis in farming. And climate-smart agriculture does incorporate at times some agroecological practices like crop rotations, sometimes intercropping, but it does continue to be committed to the technology of industrial agriculture. For example, the use of no-till farming with inputs, herbicide inputs that are dangerous for public health and the environment. Climate-smart agriculture does not explicitly reject GMOs and gene editing techniques, and so on. It relies on an eclectic mix of technologies, and within that you can find a bit of agroecology. So generally, these approaches, sustainable intensification, climate-smart agriculture, aim to increase the efficiency of resource use, so better targeting of fertilizers to use less, or promote input substitutions in otherwise unchanged monoculture farming, for example, replacing a toxic pesticide with a less toxic one. And they are linked into global value chains. So these so-called alternatives are locked into the productivist, growth-oriented paradigm of conventional development. They essentially seek to deal with the symptoms rather than tackle the root causes of the problem. And agroecology science, because it's very much about science here, agroecology science is made to fit and conform with the dominant paradigm. Now, in sharp contrast, a more transformative agroecology promotes radical changes based on the redesign and diversification of agroecosystems through the use of intercropping, agroforestry, agro-silvopastoral systems, farming much more in the image of nature, imitating the structure and function of natural ecosystems. And a transformative agroecology really seeks to reconnect biologically diverse farms with local and regional markets, linking producers and consumers in relations of proximity and greater solidarity. And I'd say that a transformative agroecology aims to re-embed production, processing, distribution, and consumption of food and fibers in a specific territory. The focus on territory is very important. And the aim here is not only to develop diverse agroecological production as well as short food chains and local markets for farmers, it's also about rebuilding local infrastructure such as micro dairies, mills, small abattoirs, community food processing units, and distributed renewable energy systems and water storing structures within the territory. And this relocalizing of food systems is based on an agrarian industrial mutualism that aims to reduce carbon and ecological footprints whilst creating local livelihoods, jobs, wealth, and culture within territories. And this kind of agroecology combines the science, or combines science with the knowledge-rich practices of farmers and the vision of social movements working for social and environmental justice, including decolonization and racial justice. And a transformative agroecology also promotes developments that really seek to enhance farmer and citizen control over the means of production, as well as possibilities for democratic governments within and between territories. So it explicitly seeks to transform the dominant agri-food regime and find ways of exiting commodity capitalism. For example, a transformative agroecology seeks to reduce dependence on corporate suppliers of external inputs and distant global commodity markets. And there's a clear commitment to viewing agroecology simultaneously as a science, as a set of practices, and a social movement, with the holistic integration of these different dimensions. And for many social movements and farmer organizations, agroecology has become explicitly linked with food sovereignty, which is an alternative paradigm to the dominant neoliberal framework for food and agriculture. So in sum, the term agroecology is now being used and reworked by different actors as part of a normative vision of the future that either seeks to conform to the dominant industrial food and farming system or to radically transform it. And I think that would be my answer to the question you asked, Emile.
Okay, thank you. I think you gave a very exhaustive answer to the question, and well, we'll come back to some discussion about that later on. But in the last few years, there's been a real increase in interest in agroecology because of the recognition of the need for transformation. Is that also translated in investments that are being made by governments, for example?
No, it's extremely disappointing. We're seeing a lot of talk about agroecology when agroecology only 10 years ago was off the radar screen and a bit of a taboo topic in mainstream organizations. Today, there's a lot of chit-chat about agroecology, but when you look at funding flows for research and development, there's really a minuscule amount of funds targeted agroecology in national economies, in development assistance, in climate funding, and projects that are tagged as sustainable largely focus on tweaking the system to sustain the industrial farming paradigm rather than transform it for social and ecological regeneration. I'll just give you some figures. It's quite startling. If you take the USA, about 0.6 to 1.5% of the entire USDA research and extension budget emphasizes agroecology in the production of knowledge. If you take UK Overseas Aid, DFID, since January 2010, no funds at all have been spent or been committed to projects with an explicit focus on development or promotion of agroecological innovations and practices in Africa, Latin America, Asia. And a similar picture prevails, sadly, for German BMZ, the French Overseas Aid, as well as EU funding. And this picture has emerged over the last 2 years. It's a disappointing picture. There's a real disconnect. And what we're seeing, a disconnect between the rhetoric and the practice. What we're actually seeing, that funding and policy bias is in favor of high external input and export-oriented industrial and green revolution agriculture. They still receive the lion's share of R&D funding.
Okay.
And I would advocate that we need to completely change that picture and ensure that the lion's share of R&D funding goes to agroecology and regenerative practices, which other speakers will be talking about. And we really need to follow the money. I think it was Noam Chomsky who said, follow the money, follow the power.
Indeed. Thank you very much. I will now pass on to Louise Luticolt and ask, how would you describe organic agriculture? Is that mainly a matter of certification?
Well, thank you, Emile, for your question, and good afternoon to everybody. It was so heartening for me to listen to Michel, and I said, I recognize that one. So what I want to share with you is, first of all, what is IFOAM? IFOAM is a global association where all organic organizations, be it farmers, processors, national movement, policymakers, are gathered globally. And in our organization, we have done some work, almost 20 years ago on defining both the principles of organic agriculture and the definition of organic agriculture. And I'll just take a second to read out the definition of organic agriculture and check that one with what Michelle said before. So through a participatory process, we came to the following definition. Organic agriculture is a production system that sustains the health of soils, ecosystems, and people. It relies on ecological processes, biodiversity, and cycles adapted to local conditions, rather than the use of input with adverse effects. Organic agriculture combines tradition, innovation, and science to benefit the shared environment and promote fair relationships and good quality of life for all involved. So that's an interesting one and much comparable with what Michel just said. Now, if farmers do these very good practices, which are also based on the principles of organic agriculture, health, ecology, fairness, and care, we want them to be recognized for that. And the problem with our imperfect world is that currently it's difficult for farmers to distinguish their good practices in the market. And so what we need is a verification model, one way or the other, and only there is where certification sometimes comes in. But verification can be done in different ways. It can be done in a participatory way in local communities. It can be done directly if I buy directly by a farmer. But if I have international trade, for instance, for commodities on coffee or tea, we want to have them certified because, and that is the case, currently products that are produced with, let's say, glyphosate, they are not indicated in the market. If there were only labels to say this product is made with glyphosate, it would be clear that consumers would be choose for something else. But since that's not the case, farmers that do good for the common good need to be able to distinguish their products, and only there's where certification come in. And I would like to make clear that certification is a tool and definitely not the purpose of organic agriculture. Now in organic, the developments have even gone one step further. And maybe it's, let's say, organic in the 80s and 90s is somewhat comparable with how we discuss now about agroecology, possible co-opting, all these kind of things. And at the time, legislators then found it important that there was no cheating on what we call organic. And that was then also the point when legislation come in. So if you ask me to describe organic agriculture, I gave you the vision of the civil society on what we decided upon ourselves. But there are also regulations, for instance, in the EU, in India, in other parts of the world, where organic agriculture is defined in a legislative way. That might be a curse, but it's also a blessing, because we're quite sure that there can be no greenwashing or co-opting with organic agriculture. And maybe this is a concern that there could be with agroecology. So far, if you ask me about organic agriculture's definition and also the relation to certification.
Thank you. But how can we identify good food? We are seeing, besides organic certification, also many businesses are developing their own standards, their own labels. And is that helping consumers making the right choices?
Well, that's a good question. I think that you are right that there's a multitude of labels out there, also industry labels that claim for being green or being fair or whatsoever. So I think in all cases, we should ask ourselves, how are these standards set and what's the purpose of them? If these standards are set by industry only, it might well be that the purpose of them actually is an extra hurdle for market access for farmers. And they are the ones who have to extra invest and pay for this, for actually the companies, if you like, to greenwash their products or cover up their ass. Sorry for my English. However, there are also standards that are made in a participatory way, as the organic standards, as other standards that there are, who, for instance, follow the ISIL Code of Conduct. Our own standards are made in a participatory way, and also the legislative processes, to some extent, are based on a legislative and representative ways. So I think it's very important to look at what is actually the purpose of this standard. And if it's only there to increase the hurdle for farmers to get access to the market, I think we should not follow them. And this is not so difficult to recognize, because if industries are really serious and some want to improve and they do make own standards, they can still combine that with publicly recognized international standards to actually make that clear. So I would give a little warning here on private standards and private labels, and rather look at the internationally acknowledged and legislative acknowledged standards. Because who knows, tomorrow a company could say, these are agroecological products with a nice, beautiful label. If it's not being verified well, if there has not been a participatory process, not a good verification through also public participation, it will be, unfortunately, greenwashing.
Thank you. I will now pass on to Chris Nichols. How would you characterize regenerative agriculture? I often hear that regenerative agriculture has put a lot of emphasis on soil health. How can you explain that? Can you explain that?
Yeah, I thank you for having me be a part of this panel. And with regenerative agriculture, sort of the new kid on the block, I guess, as far as types of labeling agriculture, regenerative agriculture is really focused on soil health and that idea of, if we are going to regenerate, it had a little bit of its origins in sustainable agriculture, but as we looked at sustainable, it wasn't about maintaining or sustaining the degraded resource that we had, and that degraded resource was essentially the soil. And so what we wanted to do was look at regenerating the soil. And if we're going to look at regenerating the soil, it is going to be looking at how the soil also originated. We didn't just have soil that didn't just come from space dust. What we had was a mineral landscape, and with the interactions of the microbial community, in particular fungi, and the plant, or at that point in time in evolution, this was a precursor to plants, a cyanobacterium, that essentially was combined together to work together to actually evolve soil. Soil is a conglomeration of organic matter, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen bound to sand, silt, and clay. And that is what is how soil was created. And so when we're looking at these regenerative practices, it is incorporating a lot of things from organic practices and from agroecology. But again, the focus here is on regenerating the soil. So utilizing those integrations between the microbial community, the plants, and the animals in order to be able to have that type of a soil regeneration that you have going on. There are various types of industries that are looking at how to do various types of labeling and standards within regenerative agriculture. And again, I think that I agree with the previous speaker, Louise, in having a need as far as marketing or other things to have various types of standards. But I think that it also is one of the things too, that as we progress forward, we need to be really united in the fact that we're really trying, from agroecology to organic to regenerative, that we're really trying to look at how we can regenerate that soil environment in order to be able to continue to produce food on this landscape.
I think that leads also to the issue of water resources. Because we know that the soil health is very much also a factor of efficiency of water. With climate change, this is becoming even more important limiting factor. So what can regenerative agriculture do about that?
Well, that's a very good question, because we are in regenerative agriculture, we are really focused on that regeneration of the soil. The soil, one, has always been the way in which we've been able to have clean water and clean air. The soil acts as a natural filtration system for water in particular, but also helping to keep particulates out of the air. So if we build up and regenerate the soil, we are going to insert more organic matter, because that's what makes soil, into that environment. And some of the best filters that we have are carbon-based filters. Water filters and air filters have a carbon base to them. And that's because carbon is really good at being able to bind various types of elements. And so that's going to allow us to be able to have clean water. So clean water is a key to this in regenerating in regenerative agriculture, but it also is water use efficiency. As we move forward, our planet is mostly water, but we're actually running into issues on the land of water scarcity. And especially with climate change, that's going to be a continuing issue that we need to address. And so as we look at that, what we want to do is maximizing the efficiencies of the processes. And when you look at the soil, we can do this by getting the microbial communities flourishing around the plant roots and allowing for a good exchange of nutrients and carbon in order to be able to keep that activity going. And because that activity is happening in the rhizosphere, the plants are more efficient at the way that they're utilizing water. There are two ways in which plants lose water. You use water as organisms as part of the biochemical processes and to solubilize and transport compounds within the bodies of the organisms. And so you have sort of internal water, but then you're also losing water externally, and plants will do that, one, through transpiration above ground, but they also lose water below ground as they're trying to move nutrients from the soil environment to their roots. So they have to create a mass flow type of movement. And when those nutrients are further and further away from the roots, that's going to result in them having to put off additional water in order to be able to create that mass flow. In addition, those nutrients, in order for them to be more available to the plants, to be in a chemical formula that is plant available, they utilize the biology in order to be able to do much of those transformations. And so they're going to have to give off exudates, carbon compounds, to try and get to the microbes. And if the microbes are spatially distributed from that rhizosphere environment, again, it's going to take more water to get those exudates out to the microbes. So you're now not efficiently utilizing water because you have to move it out into a space, into the soil environment where you have very little control. And again, as we're looking at climate change issues, we're looking at issues in which we're going to have prolonged periods where the soil is very dry, and then you're going to have periods of time where the soil is, we're going to have very heavy rainfall events or precipitation events. And what we need to do is figure out, one, how we're going to efficiently manage the water on the part of the plants. So having an active microbial community in the rhizosphere is going to help with that mass flow, and it's also going to help with the root exudates. But the other thing is that because the microbial community and this interaction between the plants and the microbes and the animals has gone on in the origination of soil, that has allowed the soil to have porosity or open space. And so we need to have that open space in the soil where you get these pellets or aggregates that are formed in the soil by the microbial processes, and between those, they don't fit tightly together. So you end up having a lot of space around that, and that open space, that porosity, allows for water to be able to get into the soil much more quickly, and for water to be able to be held in that soil for periods of time between precipitation events. And again, because we're having prolonged periods of time between precipitation events, being able to hold that water in the rhizosphere is really important. You can have really good infiltration rates with very sandy soils where you have very large pores, but the issue occurs when, with those very large pores, there isn't a lot of water holding capacity. There isn't a very much surface area on the sand particles to be able to hold the water. And because the pores are so large, it's easy for the water to run through or for the water to evaporate off. But when you have the aggregates that are helping to form the pores, you have smaller pore spaces. The individual pore size is smaller in diameter, and those pores are actually curving and bending and moving around the aggregates. And when you have those bends and curves, not only does it allow for more mass space for water to be able to get in, but it also is now going to allow for the water to be able to be held, because the energy pulling the water down and by gravity and the energy of pulling the water up for evaporation has to fight against the forces in which you have these bends and curves in the path of the water. So it's harder to pull it down and it's harder to evaporate off. So we're looking at trying to create an environment. And the great thing about working with this nexus of microbiology, plant biology, and animal biology is that nature over time has evolved to create soil which does all of these processes. And we can't mimic that with the chemical and mechanical tools that we are trying to apply. No matter how good of tools we get at things like fertilizer application, we can't get it in the rhizosphere zone at the right times in the same way that the biology is able to do. And so now you get that water loss trying to create that mass flow. We can't get the tools to mimic as well what nature can do. So in regenerative agriculture, we're really looking at how we can utilize these biologically based processes to resolve these issues.
I think you really gave a great understanding, explained well the functioning of a healthy soil and why it is so important. I hope that Mamadou Goita has been able to be connected. He had some connection problems, and I think he's still muted, but I would like to ask him what are today's reflections about the future of agriculture and food systems in Western Africa today? Mamadou, you're still muted. Mamadou, can you unmute?
Still experiencing some signal issues with Mamadou's feed. It looked good in the green room, but it's not working out right now.
Okay, then I suggest that we move on with another round of questions to the panelists. If we are able to resolve the connection problem with Mamadou, we'll come back to him after that. So I'll revert back to Michelle, but maybe before that, what we've already heard. Oh, there we are. Mamadou, can we hear you now? We still can't hear you. No. There's still a microphone problem. Sorry. Sorry, I suggest we come back to Mamadou afterwards. So I think what we've heard from the three first speakers is that there is a lot in common, and we heard certainly about organic agriculture and agroecology, that the principles are very much the same. And maybe if I can summarize it, there are more problems with greenwashing, using terminology inappropriately, rather than contradictions between organic agriculture and agroecology, and that would apply to regenerative also. But we'll come back to that in the discussion. So I want to go back to Michel Pambert. What is really blocking a more rapid transition to agroecology? I think there is really a lot of evidence available now about what can be achieved. And so why don't we see a more rapid transition?
Okay, thank you, Emile. Maybe I could ask for that PowerPoint to be shown. Thank you. This is a question that we talk a lot about in the Center for Agroecology, Water and Resilience, where I work, along with our networks across the world. And we've tried to take a big societal view as to why agroecology is not spreading and why is it spreading in some cases. So we did a recent study which is available, and I can send the link afterwards, in which we tried to understand the determinants of change, the factors that enabled and constrained a shift towards agroecology, and a shift towards a more transformative agroecology of the type I described earlier. We weren't so much interested in agroecology that conforms with the existing system or business as usual. How can we transform agroecological theory practice at a society level? And the work we did brought us to look at the literature and case studies. I'll save all the details, but essentially we identified 6 domains of transformation as being very important, and they're shown here. And if I could have the next slide, please. Could I have the next one? Yeah. So the 6 domains of transformation are listed here. The questions of access to natural ecosystems, which includes access to land, to water, to seeds, to trees and their product. There's the whole domain of knowledge and culture, which includes agricultural research. The systems of exchange referred to markets and forms of economic exchange. Local organizations and the networks they form. The questions around equity, gender, and inclusion, and how ideas shape our world, discourse. And we, looking at different case studies and the literature, made us realize that there are some disabling factors that lock in the current system along its industrial pathway, and some more enabling factors for agroecological transformation. And I don't want to detail these, but my essential point is, if I could go on to the next slide, all this information is available, but I think it should be clear to many people, if young people do not have access to land at a reasonable price or for free, it's very difficult for them to develop any kind of agroecological practice. The current constraints over seeds in the form of intellectual property rights, patents, and IPRs limits the free exchange and use of seeds in farming communities. Knowledge and culture, we essentially have public research producing knowledge that props up the industrial system rather than regenerative, organic, or agroecological. And all the signals in the market support much more global value chains, which are quite expensive in terms of fossil fuels and unaccountability, as opposed to the re-territorialization of economic exchange. So there's a mix of enabling and disabling factors. But what I want to draw your attention to is the next one. Could I go to the next one? Very often we talk about factors in isolation. We'll say it's a problem of the market, it's a problem of research, but what we think is very, very important is to focus on the interaction and the the mutual strengthening of these different domains of transformation which lock us into the current system. And second, it's very important that we think about agricultural transformation within a wider social, political, and economic context. So we need systemic rather than sectoral approaches to change, with simultaneous and mutually reinforcing actions in those 6 domains of transformation. But if I boil this down, the biggest problem, the biggest blockage to transformation is the issue of power. The concentration and centralization of power is really a key constraint for the spread of a transformative agroecology. This is something IPES Food highlighted in its scheme for lockings for change towards agroecological practice. Power was at the center, and equally we feel that power and its different manifestations really have to be tackled head on if we wish to see transformation. And by that I mean economic power, the fact that a handful of corporations control the links, each link in the food chain from seed to retail. I'm also referring to political power, technocratic governments, and top-down decision-making. The power of expert knowledge and science. Science as superior knowledge and a source of authority, neglecting other knowledges and introducing a pecking order between different knowledge systems, including the knowledge of farmers, which is not considered by this source of power of expert knowledge, but also patriarchal power, the institutionalized exploitation of women's labor and the structural violence that excludes women from decision-making and access to resources, land, seeds, water, or simply food in the household. Now, if we look at the big picture, it's very important to focus on ways of transforming these power relations, putting limits on the accumulation and concentration of power, dispersing that power into more hands, and making it much more accountable. I'm just putting that as a principle. That is what I would say in response to your question about what are the main factors limiting the spread of transformative agroecology to more people and place. The question of power in its many different manifestations. And it shouldn't stay an elephant in the room if we're serious about the question of agroecological pathways that take us to more sustainable and just futures. I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, you already mentioned some elements of enabling factors. That was going to be my next question. You know, what is necessary to, in terms of enabling factors to bring about this necessary transformation? Do you want to add something on that?
Yeah, I will, and it links to the first point. And again, it's not a series of recipes and quick fixes. It's talking about a process and highlighting some principles. And perhaps the most important is really working to reverse inequitable power relations and putting conscious limits on the accumulation of power in order to expand democracy and inclusion in the agri-food system. And democratizing power and governance is really key to agroecological transformation in many areas, including in the ecological domain. If we want to reorganize the material basis of food production in the image of nature through research and development that's based on respectful dialogues between different knowledge holders, between scientists, peasant farmers, pastoralists, and indigenous people, we have to deal with issues of power there. In the political realm, if we want to expand citizen participation and democracy in the co-production of knowledge, policies, and agri-food systems, which is, you know, a key theme in this agroecology that aligns with food sovereignty and the right to food, here too we have to confront these questions of power. How do we democratize power and governance? And in the economic realm, the whole challenge of inventing forms of economic organization that can re-territorialize food and wealth production whilst creating free time for people to shape and re-govern food systems is very, very important. So these are big questions. But I would say that we are in an exceptionally perilous moment. We're faced with major existential threats. We've known this for 40 years, but really we're reaching important tipping points, as you mentioned in your introduction, Emile, and we need to think very, very strategically about where we should put our efforts. And I suggest that we think about transforming, redistributing, democratizing power. And in so doing, we might start solving problems not only in the field of food and agriculture, but also in health, education, housing, etc. These issues are in.
Thank you. I think this issue that is indeed often an elephant in the room about power relations is extremely important. I understand that Mamadou Goita has been able to resolve the connection. Is that so, Mamadou?
Can you hear me now?
Thank you. Yes, we can. So I was going to ask you, what are today's reflections about the future of agriculture and food systems in West Africa today?
Thanks very much, Emile. And then hearing all these fantastic contributions to this debate. So I'm really happy just to be with friends on this webinar. Yeah, in West Africa, to speak just very quickly because we don't have enough time, that actually the debate is how to organize different movements that exist in the region, because we have just realized that there are so many challenges that the region is facing that are related to the food system. If you look at the trends on that lead us to have all these very fantastic meetings in Yeleni on food sovereignty, that the debate that was open at ECOWAS level, that has been the first region to put food sovereignty in the policy document, our regional policy, common agricultural policy that is called ECOWAP, has been highlighting already in 2000 the concept of food sovereignty in this document. Countries like Mali, Senegal also have been working on that. So it's open debate on agroecology as a response to different challenges that the region is facing in terms of food shortage in some places, but also the sustainability issue that has been mentioned earlier by some of my colleagues who has been speaking before me. So the debate is actually open, how to organize things in a way that will address some of the key obstacles that exist in this region that is preventing us to achieve this transition that we have been talking about for some years now.
Okay, what are really the fears about the future of agriculture and food systems in the region?
Yeah, there are different issues that we can address. You know, we have been working on this process with FAO, that is a network that has been created actually in the region to address collectively this kind of obstacles. So we identify 8 of them, and very quickly, I won't be in a position to comment all of them because it's really very long and we don't have enough time. The first one is access to finance. So, you know, the financial system that we have actually, the funding system that you have actually in the region, but also with some of the kind of partnerships that are developed, are not really relevant to support agroecological initiatives in the region. This is the first one. The second one is access to some of the resources for production, mainly land and water. This is also a very key problem that we have been highlighting in different reports. And access to seeds and organic inputs is also one of the obstacles that we are facing just to address the issue of agroecology. And there is a big problem also that we highlight in the different report. This is the access to market, because the territorial market organization is a very critical thing that can not only help to make these linkages between food production, the food consumption, and the food market system that is developed. So actually, there are many research that we are trying to do to understand in a better way the functionalities of this territorial market, so that the agroecological product can be really not only recognized as going in the sustainable way, but also that will be the key response to some of the challenges related to climate change, but also to the difficulty that we have to organize the food system. The other challenge that we have is the political obstacles. Looking at how some of the decision makers are just constitute barriers to to achieving some of these things, and how collectively we can address the issue altogether in the region, that not only going with different political instruments, but also implementing some of the programs that are related to this policy. So the coherency between policies is one of the key threats that we need to address. Another one is how the different practices that exist can be scaled up so that they can be really not only helping those who don't have this experience to just work on them, to learn about it collectively, but also to address some of the key technical things that they have at different level. And the second one, the second one is bringing evidence to bear. And the last one that we identify is the fragmentation of the movement that are working on agroecological perspective. So we need to bring our synergies together and then see how to move forward in using agroecology as a key response to some of the challenges that we are facing actually in the region. So these are some of the key things that we need to address so that we can achieve, a transition and agroecology level in this region.
Thank you, Mamadou. I'll revert back to Louise now. And Mamadou already mentioned the issue of markets. What about access to markets for sustainably produced food? Do we have a level playing field there? This issue of true cost of food, is that properly reflected in markets today?
Well, Emil, this is such an important question. And I think this also brings all the initiatives where we discussed today about together, because we are operating currently in a context where it's financially more advantageous to harm the environment and exploit people, negatively affect their health, than it actually is to protect and enhance our natural resources and strive for well-being. And that has to do with the context in which we're operating, and also Michelle and Mamadou already pointed to that. So currently all the, let's say, negative effects, they are treated as externalities, and the cost to mitigate these negative impacts, that is now left to society to carry, instead of them being included in the price of the product. So basically what you see at the counter of a market or on a supermarket is not the real cost. It's not the real, representing the real price. And that is because most of the time we pay 4 times for our food. In many cases, consumers pay through their taxes so that there can be subsidies for farmers and pointing them into a direction that's unsustainable. Then we pay at the counter. Then taxes are being used to mitigate externalities. And finally, we also see that there are health costs. So currently, all these costs are being externalized. And let's say the more you pollute, if I can put it like that, the cheaper it gets. Whereas the systems we talk about today, they actually try to internalize all these costs. And on top of them, some also have the challenge then of verification costs. So first of all, conventional agriculture is not showing the real cost or the externalities, and that actually makes it as an unlevel playing field for all the farmers that want to do good. So what we need, by full cost accounting, for instance, make those externalities visible and influence the narratives. There's no such thing as cheap food. Cheap food comes at a high price. That's how it currently is. And we need to provide tools to optimize public good and also use these arguments for policy reform so that food system policies do incentivize public goods and disincentivize public bads. So that will also mean then that the food system actors optimize the public good, and that then means that product price would integrate positive and negative externalities, and we can see the real price of good. Only then we would have a level playing field. So it's about the context in which we need to operate. All of us who strive to truly sustainable agriculture. And I think that's where the crux is. And yes, this has to do a lot with power. As Michelle said, this has to do with consistencies in policies, as Mamadou says. So it's about the context in which we can work and in which we actually enable farmers to work.
Are there other things that we can do to bring greater fairness in access to healthy food?
Yeah, I think so. Actually, I think the one and simple thing would be banning a lot of unhealthy things. So if we really were to ban glyphosate, I think the overall access to healthy food would already be better. But I think there's also a point on awareness raising. And many consumers also want to do good. And we also see now in the corona crisis that people are looking for healthy food. They are concerned about their health. And so there's also a point on what is then healthy food. And fair access, I think, also has to do with prices. Fair prices, however, also for the farmers. As I earlier said, cheap food is not a concept that we should strive for. It comes at all times at a high cost. So we must actually realize what it is worth to have good food and be honest about that. I think that is an important thing that we need to do. And then, as I said already, the overall context in which our production takes place, that's an important one. And luckily, I think what we see happening currently, that there is a lot of interest in moving to healthy diets and good food. Another form of fair access to healthy diets is actually changing diets. Do we really need to eat a lot of the crap that we pay a lot of money for that we currently do? So these are, let's say, questions that comes more with awareness raising that can be set in a political context so that it's advantageous for farmers to do good. So that's what I would like to contribute so far.
Okay, thank you. I'll come back now to Chris. I think that all over the world we are seeing farmers are aging, and it's difficult to get young farmers to join the business. What's the situation in the US?
Emile, as you said, it is happening all over the world. The U.S., I think, is one of the leading countries in the fact of the age of farmers. As far as the majority of our farmers are at or past retirement age, or what you would see as retirement age in a typical Western world. But we do need to figure out ways to be able to incentivize young people to come into agriculture. And there's some potential for multiple pathways to do that. When we talk about, as Michelle and Mamadou pointed out, equity issues become a big thing in order to be able to incentivize young people to come into agriculture. So there are various types of investment programs that are being set up and ways to be able to look at agriculture where can we design it that it, instead of it being basically something where the farmer themselves owns the land, all of the land, but is it more of a business type of an operation so that you have things like health plans and vacation plans and retirement plans and those types of things, because we don't have that in farming. And in the US, we don't have a nationalized healthcare program, so that becomes a very big issue for farmers. As far as being able to do that, because it isn't a job in which you have those types of benefits. So are there ways when we look at farm equity to be able to figure out ways to be able to, again, provide the support as young people are looking at the jobs that they want to have? If you have a job that has no real safety net beyond some fluctuating subsidy programs that are based on commodities, where you don't have, like I said, a retirement plan or a health plan or a vacation plan, why would you really want to do that? It's a 24/7, 365 job. And if you have to do that for 60 to 70 years, there's no real incentive for you to want to go into that. And so I think we need to find ways to do that better.
Thank you. A quick answer on the following question. I sometimes hear that alternatives to conventional or industrial agriculture only work at a small scale. What's your view on that?
The alternatives, and that's one of the great things I think about these alternatives to conventional agriculture, is that they are scale neutral. It's about the plethora of tools and practices that you can put into place, and you can, if you're focused on the principles of restoring and regenerating the soil, then that helps you to find tools that will fit within any size of farming operation.
Okay. Thank you. I'll come back now to Mamadou for a last question. How would you describe what is needed to transition to more resilient and sustainable agriculture and food systems from your perspective? Mamadou?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, now.
No, there are some of the key points that really need to be addressed so that we can leverage and consolidate what is going on actually. The first thing is just working on alliance building for collective action. So this is really very important just for the collective learning process, to mutualize also resources and to mutualize also techniques and all that is needed today to be addressed in the different obstacles that I mentioned earlier. The second thing I think that can be done is just to do reforms on the governance of the food system, because we have so many problems, related to that. There is a different contradiction that I want to elaborate here, but this contradiction that is really constituting a constraint for the food system need to address. So this is about governance, how this triangle between production, adding value to the product in terms of consumption, and the food webs and related to the market system should be addressed. And this is really related to the kind of governance that we are putting on board. The third thing that can be also done is just to change the economic system that we are in actually is very problematic. So there are different orthodoxies that are leading our processes should be addressed. So there is a new way of thinking about this economic development of different territories should be addressed in looking at the perspective upstream and downstream, the food production system, then in the agroecological model that we want to develop. So this is something that is very important in the sense that it gives ways to rethink our way of looking at the socioeconomic development perspective of territories, aligned with how people are producing, the way that they are producing, but also how it's helping to support the economic system via territorial market, but also some of the processing things that is done mainly in our case by women and youth in a sense. And we need also to work on the fact that agroecology is a response to the different crises that we have actually. We just realized, very small things that I can mention during the COVID-19, the very beginning. It has been constituting a problem for some countries that were completely fully engaged in the chemical import system, because everything was done around the health product that was imported, and those who were really binded to the chemical system have been, even some producers cannot even produce in their own farm because they couldn't access to this thing that is external to the production system that they have. So it's a way of looking at agroecology as a response to different crises that we have, and we need to put emphasis on the way that we produce, the way that we process, and the way that we are organizing the market system. So these are some of the things that need to be done. So we need to have a policy reform in that sense, but also reorganizing social movement around agroecology and try to develop some of the technical knowledge and background and research, putting emphasis on what kind of research that we need in a participatory way, and how this research in a participatory way can be, drivers also to push the production systems in the different species, different territories, knowing that we cannot talk about agroecology if we don't talk about the upstream and downstream things that need to be done. So there is an interconnection between them, and we need really to address it in a very coherent way. So policy framing and all these are very critical to that. Thanks.
Thank you. I understand that the broadcasting session should be closed now, and we will have the discussion in a Zoom room. So you will see in the chat the link to the Zoom room for the discussion. And I look forward to joining you there shortly. I am now connecting to that Zoom room. Thank you very much.